As Stephen said earlier, today marks the beginning of a new sermon series, and it's become a bit of a tradition here at Renewal, where during the summer months, we typically have a series where we go through some sort of biblical theme, something that kind of plays out throughout the Bible, kind of beginning to end, and we kind of follow that thread. Because there's all of these images, all of these motifs, all of these pictures that God gives us that he recurs and reuses to help drive home these points. So a couple summers ago, we went through the idea of water, and we looked at how water plays out from the beginning to the end of the Bible. And last year we looked at trees, and so this year we're going to look at mountains. We're going to be looking at what feature mountains play in the Bible, what feature mountains, what happens on mountains. So we're going to be looking at various mountains throughout the scriptures. And part of the reason we do this, other than it's kind of fun, but in addition, when we think about the world that God has made, when we think about water, and we think about trees, and we think about mountains, when we see all this stuff, it's easy just to think, like, that's just a given. Yep, that's there. But if we believe that God made these things, right, then this is part of God's, you could say, message to the world, that he's teaching us something. So Jesus will point to birds, and he'll point to flowers to make points. And when you think about, like, if I'm trying to explain something to somebody, right, I'm trying to help you understand something that maybe is difficult to grasp or a little abstract, right, I reach around for analogies. Well, it's kind of like if you've ever been in a party and this happens to you, or it's kind of like when you're hiking and this happens, right? I'm looking for some sort of experience. I'm looking around to say, hey, what's something I can pull from that we have some common ground? But it's different when it comes to God, because God doesn't look around and say, all right, what can I use to help explain something? Instead, because he's the one who ultimately was revealing himself through the scriptures, also revealed himself in creation and said, what can I make to help people understand this? So for instance, a couple years ago we talked about how when God wants to help us think through, what does it mean that I had sin and imperfection and I've been cleansed of that? He said, I'm going to make this thing called water. And so people of all different cultures will wash themselves. So when I come to them and say, hey, forgiveness is just like being washed with water, it's like, oh, that makes sense. Right? So God actually communicates through the world that he's made. Now, sometimes we call this general revelation, okay? Because it's available to anyone. You don't need the Bible to look at the stars and say, wow, this is a vast and complex universe. And if somebody made this, they're powerful. And you don't need the Bible to look at the diversity amongst animals and creatures and how they play off one another symbiotically and say, wow, look at this, that somebody has crafted this in such a way where things are in balance and in harmony and it's beautiful. Right? That's generally available to everybody. Now, it's not going to tell you everything you need to know, like who is it who made this stuff, and how do I become right with him, and what does he think of me? Right? That stuff you need a revelation that we find in Jesus, right? And through the scriptures. But the reason why we do this series is because it's God's invitation to say, hey, these are things that I've put into this world for your benefit. I've put these things to help teach you lessons. And so as we go through the scriptures and we look at mountains, it's an invitation to not only track the threads and the ideas in the Bible, but also then to say, when I look at the mountains, which as Stephen said, we get to do all the time, which is remarkable. I grew up 0 mountains in Minnesota. We get to see, you're on I-25 in traffic, and you're just like, oh, there's the mountains. Like, when you're hiking, when you're up in the mountains for a weekend or something, it's an invitation to look at those parts of creation and to be reminded of the truth that God has embedded them with. And to say that even the mountains that are right next to us are an invitation to remember who God is and what he's done. And so we're going to be taking the next 6 weeks to go through the Bible and look at a handful of mountains and the themes that they portray and capture for us. Now, I'm going to be honest, I had like a 3-month sermon series planned for this, and then we were working on the schedule, and I was told I had 6 weeks. So we cut a lot of mountains. There's a lot of good things we can't cover. But what we're going to do today is we're going to start off with the first time mountains are mentioned, and the first mountain that's given a name, as Stephen said, Mount Ararat. And this is in the story of the flood. And so right off the bat, what we're going to be looking at is how mountains convey an image of strength and refuge and safety. Which makes sense, because we'll read a bit of the story of the flood in a moment here, but if you know anything about floods, right, what are you supposed to do? You get to the highest place possible, right? Get to the high ground, right? As water's coming up, you go find a hill, you go find, your roof, you go upwards, right? Likewise, when you think about historically when people were fighting, if you had battles, right, you would want to defend yourself on the high ground. This is why castles were often built on hills and stuff, right? Because if you were under attack, you wanted the advantage and the safety that comes from being high up. There's an advantage to that. And so mountains for us are going to capture this idea of refuge and strength and somewhere to run to when we're in danger or under attack. We're going to look at how that plays out a little bit in the story of the flood. So just to recap for those who aren't super familiar, just so we're on the same page. In Genesis, everything's made good. The world's perfect. It's wonderful. And then this thing called sin enters, and it just messes everything up. And pretty soon people are doing wicked things to each other. People are harming one another. People are living evilly. And God does not like sin. He does not like wickedness. He does not like evil. And so he sends a flood to judge the world and to wipe out all of the wickedness, to try and wipe out all of this sin. And everything is wiped out except for a man named Noah and his family. And he takes two of every kind, right? Two of every kind of creature. And they get on this ark, this big boat. And that's how they ride out the flood. So where we're going to pick up in this story is Noah and his family and the creatures. They're on the ark. And the flood waters are over the earth. And we're going to look at how mountains play out in this story. So this is in Genesis chapter 7, starting in verse 17. All right. The flood continued 40 days on the earth. The waters increased and bore up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. The waters prevailed and increased greatly on the earth, and the ark floated on the face of the waters. And the waters prevailed so mightily on the earth that all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered. The waters prevailed above the mountains, covering them 15 cubits deep, and all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds, livestock, beasts, all swarming creatures that swam on the earth, and all mankind. Everything on the dry land in whose nostrils was the breath of life died. He blotted out every living thing that was on the face of the ground. Man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens, they were blotted out from the earth. Only Noah was left, and those who were with him in the ark. And the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days. But God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the livestock that were with him in the ark. And God made a wind blow over the earth, and the waters subsided. The fountains of the deep and the windows of the heaven were closed. The rain from the heavens were restrained, and the waters receded from the earth continually. At the end of 150 days, the waters had abated. And in the 7th month, in the 17th day of the month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. So again, those are the first mountains mentioned, the first mountains named, Mount Ararat. For what it's worth, it's modern Turkey, right? It's not really important for today, but if you're curious, like, where is that? That's where it is. So what you have in this story, right, you have these floodwaters coming over the whole earth and covering everything. And what I love is that picture at the very end where you have the ark coming to rest on this mountain, Mount Ararat. And if you can just picture for a moment, if you've ever been out on the ocean or the sea or one of the Great Lakes or something, when you look around, it's just like water everywhere, right? Like no land in sight. You can picture, like, that's the view from this ark, right? Everything's underwater. And then they land on this mountain, and you can picture this little, like, island sticking out of the water, this mountain. And they look around, it's just water everywhere. It's just chaos and death and destruction. And God has brought them safely to this little patch of refuge, this little sturdy ground in the midst of it. Because as the waters recede, of course, obviously the tallest thing's going to pop up first, which is the mountains. And so the ark comes to rest on this Mount Ararat. And like I said, this kind of captures this idea that as waters are swirling and destruction and chaos is all around, right, God brings his people to this little mountain. Well, I guess not little, it's sticking above the water. And that's where they have refuge. That's where they have safety. And when we think about refuge in life, I like that word a lot. We don't always use that, but sometimes we use it in terms of ideas. We say, hey, no matter what happens, I take refuge in the fact that I did my part, right? Group project. I'm going to get a C on it, but I take refuge in the fact that I carried out my end of the bargain, right? So we use it in that sense, but this idea of the place that I go to when I'm under threat, when I'm fearful, right? What is it that I hang on to? And I think that one litmus test that you can use is if you find yourself facing some sort of challenge in life, some sort of chaos, some sort of destruction, some sort of fear, if you fill in this blank, no matter what happens, at least I have blank. It's a good way to test out what is your refuge? No matter what happens, right? You think about a flood, right? No matter what happens, we can always go up to the mountains, right? If the water comes this high. No matter what happens, at least I have this person in my life. So for some of us, our refuge, we'll even call people our rock, right? Could be a sibling, could be a spouse, could be a friend. Say, no matter what happens, at least I have my brother, and I can lean on him, and I can talk to him, and he can steady things when everything feels chaotic. He can kind of calm me down, and Or when this person who, when I'm feeling self-doubt or guilt and shame, they're going to remind me, no, you're a good person, no, it's okay, right? When I talk me off the ledge when I'm confronted with my own shortcomings. So for some of us, our refuge could be somebody in our life, somebody, again, we call them our rock. Like, I lean on you through all things, and when life's chaotic, you're who I'm going to go to, right? You're the mountain I'm going to flee to. For some of us, it could be, financial stability. Like, if I can just kind of get everything in order, right? If I can build up enough security, then no matter what happens, I can always pay the unexpected bills. I can always get through. I can always fix the problem, right? So if I have enough money, I can always buy whatever it takes. I can reserve whatever it takes to reserve to get myself through the situation, right? And so when push comes to shove, it's like, hey, no matter what happens, right? I know that I have enough saved up, okay? I know that I have enough at my disposal. I think in today's world, too, and this was something suggested to me, but I think it's very true, when you think about chaos, I mean, the world feels pretty chaotic right now. And there's ideological battles and people shouting at one another. And sometimes our refuge comes in like that one TV personality or YouTuber or podcaster who we look at the world and it's just a mess. But they speak so confidently and so clearly. It's always like, oh, I'm going to listen to them religiously because they make sense of everything. And in the midst of chaos, like I know that I can rely on them. Whatever it is, this idea of refuge is this idea that there's somewhere that in the midst of the floods of life, the chaos, the destruction, the sin of life, this is where I go to. This is where I'm going to say, hey, this is the high ground that I can run to, that if all else fails, I can find safety here. When I feel endangered, when I feel attacked, when I feel threatened, this is what I rely on. This is where I take refuge in. Now, the interesting thing about the story of the flood, right, is at the peak of the flood, how many mountains are sticking out of the water? 0. At the height of the flood, we're told that all of the tallest mountains are underwater, right? There's nothing sticking out. It's not until the waters recede that Mount Ararat sticks out, okay? So at the height of the flood, how many mountains are you able to flee to that are going to save you from that flood? None of them, right? You can imagine somebody there who's like, all right, no matter what happens, I'm next to this mountain, I'll just run up there. There's a point where the water gets too high, right? And you're left to swim, right? And that's for some of us, like our refuge isn't a place, but it's just this idea that, like, no matter what happens, I'm going to put my head down, I'm going to work myself out of the situation. Like, I'm going to doggy paddle for as long as it takes. I can only doggy paddle so long. I can't doggy paddle for 40 days. And so what you see in the flood is that in life, right, what was the cause of the flood? The flood was caused by the sin and the evil and the wickedness of this world. And in this world, there's too much chaos, there's too much wickedness and too much evil for anything in creation to save us from it. Because at the height of the flood, there was nowhere you could go that you were safe from that flood. There was no mountain tall enough. It was all underwater, right? And so what the flood shows us is that no refuge in creation can save from all the floods of life. So for instance, let's say that my brother is like my rock. He's everything. What happens when life throws a curveball and all of a sudden he has unexpected duties taking care of his in-laws? And he doesn't have time for me all the time because he's got other responsibilities. And so when I'm going through my stuff and I'm like, oh, I got to lean on you, he says, I'm so sorry, but I got other things to tend to right now. I can't talk. Or when that friend of ours, something happens in our relationship and things just aren't quite the same and we don't feel like we can really lean on them the same way, or God forbid, life pulls us apart or separates us or somebody dies. Those flood, no matter how tall that mountain seems, no matter how secure that person seems, those floodwaters can always get above it. Or money, right? Like, money can seem to solve a lot of problems, but fix a strained relationship with a child, you can try and throw money at it, it's not going to fix it. You think about that thinker, that personality that we love, and man, they make sense of everything, and they seem so righteous and good, and then they have some sort of moral failing. Or all of a sudden they change their mind. They stood for one thing, and then they come out and they say, no, actually, I've come to think something differently. And you're like, wait, you were the voice of reason and stability. Now you've changed, or you've let yourself down. And all of a sudden, that mountain peak doesn't seem so secure anymore. And this is true. You can pick any single thing in this life. When you think about that question, if all else fails, if no matter what happens, at least I can rely on blank. At least I have blank. If you fill in anything in creation, it's never going to be able to withstand the chaos of life. It's never going to be able to withstand all of the sin and the wickedness and evil and the unpredictability. Because if you've ever been out there, like when you were a kid, if you ever went to one of those wave pools, you thought it was so fun to like jump in the waves, and all of a sudden that big one comes and it just like wipes you out, right? Those mountains are all underwater eventually. But the key thing here is, right, what did I say? No refuge in creation can save from all the floods of life. So nothing in this world, no creation can save from that flood that can engulf everything. But there are people who survived the flood, right? And they didn't take refuge in a mountain. They didn't take refuge in fleeing to a particular place, but they fled to a person. Because God, who is not of this creation, he's the one who made it, first and foremost, and he works in it, but he's not in creation. He's above it. He's working through it. They fled to him. So when God comes to Noah and says, hey, Noah, I'm sending a flood, and here's what you need to do. You need to listen to me, right? You need to build a boat. It's going to be a really big boat. You got to get a bunch of animals on it. And so the people who made it through the ark, they didn't rely on any earthly mountain. They relied on a person, the promise of God. He said, get in this boat and I will take care of you, and I'll bring you to a sure place. I will get you through the chaotic waters of this life, and I will get you to sturdy ground once again. Which is why I love that psalm that Stephen read for us at the beginning of service, Psalm 46. I just want to look at the first 3 verses again for us. Where these authors, they're called the sons of Korah, they write for us, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth give way, though the mountains be moved into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains tremble at its swelling. I love this picture of, again, they're contrasting mountains and water, right? And you find the mountains in the heart of the sea, which guess what? You did in the flood. Like when Noah was in that boat, they looked down, the mountains are all underwater. They're in the heart of the sea. But in the midst of all of that, we will not fear because God is our refuge and strength, a very present help. Because the way through the flood was not anything on earth, but it was the one who is above earth, the one who is over all things, the one who made those mountains, the one who made the flood, the one who made them. And so you see that when we think about that question, right? No matter what happens, at least I have blank. If it's anything in creation, it can't withstand. But if it's the one who made creation, well, then he's still in control. And this is something that plays out. So when Jesus looked at a world that was dealing with the same problem as the world of the flood. So before the flood, God looked at the world and he saw sin and he saw wickedness and he saw evil. He saw all sorts of people doing all sorts of vile things. And it's the same world that Jesus stepped into. He looked down at the world and he saw evil and he saw sin and he saw wickedness. And he decided the way that I'm going to make it through is not an ark this time, but I'm going to come myself to bring people through with me. And so he comes and he proclaims this kingdom that's everlasting, that's going to withstand every flood, that's going to withstand every bit of chaos, into an everlasting kingdom that's perfect and good. And he tells people, whoever hears my word and obeys them is like a wise man who builds their house on a rock. And though the water and the winds come and beat at it, it holds, because the foundation is sturdy. So though those who would hear me but disregard my words, right? Like building on sand, right? It's taking refuge in anything else because it can't withstand the waves. But the way that Jesus was going to make a way through the chaos, he was going to spearhead it. He was going to lead the way. And so he took all of the chaos and wickedness of sin head on. He invited it to him. So he brought it upon himself. And sin and wickedness fought against him. And ultimately he was crucified. He was rejected by the world he came to save. And what's fascinating is when you look at where Jesus was crucified, where Romans would crucify somebody, was they would want to put him up somewhere high. Now, I'm not going to pretend that Jesus was crucified on a 14er. He wasn't. Sometimes you see those stock footage, B-rolls of like a cross, like at the highest mountain peak. That would be pretty impractical, like hike all the way up there every time you had to execute somebody. But the Romans would put crucifixions on a high place because they wanted people to walk by and see. They wanted people to, as a deterrent, like don't do what they did or you'll end up like them. And so they took Jesus to this hill, this high place where people would walk past and see. And we're told this is in the Gospel of Mark, and they brought him to the place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull. And they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it, and they crucified him. So they take him to this kind of high point outside the city, right, called Golgotha, which means place of the skull. Now, you don't have to remember all of this, but that word for skull in Latin is throughout the history of the church, as the church moved into Latin-speaking languages, it got translated into Latin, which the word for skull is Calvary, which in English gets turned into the word Calvary. And you'll see that sometimes we sing about this in our songs. Sometimes we use this in our prayers, where we talk about Mount Calvary. This place of the skull, this not a 14er, but this mountain where Jesus was crucified, this high place that people looked up to and they saw him hanging on a cross. And what's so beautiful about this is when we think about taking refuge, right? We think about, where do I flee to? God gave us a mountain to run to, believe it or not. And it wasn't a mountain because it was high or particularly pretty, but it was the mountain that his son gave his own life for you. It was the mountain where he shed his own blood to redeem you, to forgive you, to ransom you. And it's Mount Calvary. And so the only mountain of true refuge is Mount Calvary. When you think about your life, when you think about where do I turn to in the midst of the troubles and the challenges of the attacks of this world, it has to be Mount Calvary. It has to be the place where Jesus was on the cross, hung, and died. When I'm feeling riddled with guilt and shame, right, the first place I need to go to is not somebody who's going to tell me, no, you're not that bad. The first place I need to go to is Calvary, where Jesus said, I love you so much that I washed all of those sins away. You're clean, you're forgiven. When I'm trying to make sense of who I am, the first place I go to is not that podcaster that says things so confidently, but it's Calvary, where Jesus said, you know who you are? In me, you are my son, you are my daughter, you are beloved, you are chosen, you are loved. When I'm facing the stresses and the worries of this world, and I say, I don't know how I'm going to get through tomorrow or next week, and I don't know where this world is going. It feels like everything's just burning up, natural disasters and violence and wars and chaos and division. We go to Calvary, where he says, I have reconciled the world to God. And in me, you have peace and security that's going to withstand all of whatever's happening now, whatever the current events are. This is going to last to eternity, because I've died and I've risen. And so when we think about our lives and we think about no matter what happens, at least I have, for us it always has to be, at least I have Calvary. At least I have Jesus. The one who is above all of the waters, the one who has brought us into his ark to withstand all the chaoses of life and is bringing us to the shores of a heavenly place, a new creation, a new earth that's never going to be destroyed again, that's never going to have violence or fear. That's what he's done. And so first and foremost, I just invite you as we start this series to look around and to stop and take a moment to appreciate the mountains. Next time you're stuck in traffic on I-25, please don't rear-end anyone. Don't tell them, like, well, my pastor told me to. But take a moment to look over. Next time you're up there hiking, next time you get away for a weekend or something, next time you go fishing, just take a moment to just stand in awe at the strength and the majesty, the power of God's creation. These mountains he's made as symbols of his refuge, his strength, the place that we can flee to, and when everything else fails, we go there. And then I invite you to think through, when I find myself under attack or fearful, where do I turn for refuge? And this does not mean you don't lean on your brother. This does not mean you don't use the resources at your disposal, but it means that first and foremost, when that thing comes up and you find yourself wondering, what in the world am I going to do? Is my first step, let me try and figure it out on my own, let me lean on these people or these things, or is my first step to go in prayer? Say, Lord, you're the only one who can carry me through this, by whatever means. Is my first step to go to the scriptures or to go and hear his word and worship and say, Lord, what do you say? What are you doing about this? And then, guess what? We have all these other things that God has given us. He's given us brothers and sisters. He's given us loved ones and resources and wise people that we can lean on, right? Just like God gave the mountains. He brought them to Mount Ararat. He carried them through the water, and he said, great, it's time for you to have something sturdy. Here's a mountain to land on. He's given you people. He's given you stuff. But the first step is him. The first step is when I'm fearful, when I'm trying to figure out how do I get myself out of this mess? What do I do? How do I fix this? Let me go to him in prayer, in his word. Say, Lord, you're the one who carries. You're the one who saves. And so then I invite you to ask, what would it look like for me to take refuge in Christ on Calvary above all? And so what can you do when you're faced with those worries, those anxieties, those attacks, those challenges in life, to make your first instinct, right? Lord, I'm turning to you first. If I'm going to get through this flood, it's your grace. It's your mercy. Because this God loves you so much that he gave his son to die on a mountain. So when you look to that, you can know that he is in control, that he has done something about the chaotic waters of this life, and he's carrying you through to the other side. He is our refuge and our strength. In Jesus' name, amen.